Hi class, welcome to Historical and Philosophical Foundations of Psychology. I'm going to be the professor this semester. My name is Brian Harding, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm going to first introduce myself and tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll talk to you about the class, the basic goals of the class, and how we're going to conduct it since we have to do it all online. I've been at TWU for about 14 years. I am the one full-time philosophy professor in the department, and last year I served as chair, so a lot of y'all might know me from that experience and don't hold it against me. I like to think I'm a much better teacher than administrator. I came to TWU about 14 years ago, as I said. Prior to that, I was in Ohio teaching at Xavier University. Before that, I was in Atlanta as an adjunct while I was finishing my degree, although I did my degree not in Atlanta, but actually in New York City at Fordham University in the Bronx, which was a whole lot of fun. I really loved the Bronx, and interestingly enough, I was born there, so I was able to kind of like return to my, place of birth and see a lot of things and places that I had heard about my whole life from my parents who were both from that area, and, go to some of the same bars that my mom and dad went to back in the day. So it was a fun experience, and I made a lot of good friends there in graduate school. And then, I had to dissertate and move on. Since coming to TWU, I've, done a fair bit, and I guess I'll do a little bit of show and tell, and this will give you an idea of what my research has been, but I've been using the books to hold up the computer, so now I'm going to have to shake the camera a little bit. The first book that I published, which was based on my doctoral dissertation, was this one, Augustine and Roman Virtue, and it's about the reception and critique of ancient Roman ideas of virtue and happiness and the like by Augustine of Hippo, who was a very influential figure in the transition, you might say, between late ancient and early medieval philosophy. And that was derived or based on my doctoral dissertation. And after that, I decided I wanted to work more in contemporary philosophy and more current things, in particularly what's phenomenology and existentialism. So a couple years ago, I edited a book and published it with a friend of mine called Early Phenomenology. And, phenomenology basically is born around the same time as psychology, around 1900. And we focused on figures basically writing between 1900 and 1950. That we felt had been understudied or underappreciated, and we gathered a bunch of essays about them. Then, most recently, I think like 2 years ago, I published this book called Not Even a God Can Save Us Now, Reading Machiavelli After Heidegger. And it's a weird book. I wrote, for my own edification, not as a contribution to scholarship or anything like that. I think that many times with writing, the journey is more important than the destination. But it had a good destination. It came out with McGill, Queen's University Press in Canada. But it's a strange book. It bounces back and forth between Machiavelli and then contemporary philosophers like Heidegger and Derrida and René Girard and people like that. And in an odd way, it's a sequel to not Augustine and Roman Virtue, but the way Augustine and Roman Virtue would have come out if it was better. But that said, now I am in the closing stages of editing another book on a French phenomenologist named Michel Henry, and I should be sending the PDF files over to the publisher any day now, and hopefully that'll sort of keep me satisfied for a while and focusing on teaching. And as you can see, I'm sitting here in my garage making this video because, like I'm sure many of you, I have e-learning, homeschooling, whatever you call it, going on due to COVID. and this is the quietest part of my house. And there we go. All right, so that's enough about me. So let me now tell you about the class and how I am imagining it or how I am planning it, and briefly go over some of the assignments that we'll be doing this semester. Any class that's kind of a history of a discipline is usually sort of a story of progress, of how, we started out small, but now here we are at the top, and, things have just gotten better and better in our discipline. And it's basically sort of a self-congratulatory story that members of the discipline tell themselves about themselves. And as such, it is sort of entirely uninteresting. And so I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this class that will, hopefully in the broadest terms, address the question of what is psychology and where does it come from. And one of the things that we'll talk about in the coming weeks is that once upon a time, there was no such thing as psychology. There was no university department, known as psychology. There was no area of study known as psychology. In fact, the word psychology for many thousands of years didn't exist, even though it has Greek roots, right? And we'll talk about this. Psychology is formed from the Greek words psyche and logos, and psyche can mean sort of very primitively, it might just mean breath, but it can also mean sort of like life, and it got translated into Latin as anima, which has more of the connotations of the soul. And then logos is a discourse, a speech, a word. And so we might say, well, psychology is formed from these Greek roots, psyche and logos, so clearly the ancient Greeks had something like psychology, so psychology has always existed. One of the things that we'll talk about in the first couple weeks of the class is that that's not true. We'll have an article that we can read that will actually tell us when the word psychology was first formulated, and then we'll look at how the first generation of self-identified psychologists tried to invent psychology, explain what it was about, what it was for, what it was doing, and how it related to other pre-existing disciplines to their peers. And as we do that, what I want us to think about is what the French philosopher Jacques Derrida called the question before the question, right? So rather than looking at, what experiments did Wilhelm Wundt do and what results did he find from doing these experiments, what I want us to focus on is, why did Wilhelm Wundt think that experiments were the right way to answer his question? How did he frame his questioning such that his method seemed like an appropriate way of addressing the question? And if that seems sort of an abstract and weird way to proceed, don't worry, we'll spend the first couple weeks of the semester reading philosophers of various sorts that will sort of put us in a position to understand what it means to sort of focus on the question before the question. Once we finish reading those sort of preparatory texts, and I'll sort of try to guide you through those as much as can be done online, we will sort of turn to the reading of the first one or two generations of psychologists and looking mainly at what I would call their programmatic texts. The texts where they, again, explain what it is that they think they're doing, why they think they're doing it, and how they relate to other peers and co-workers in sort of academic life. And we'll read those with an eye towards, again, like the question before the question. As the class goes on, we'll sort of move farther away from that first generation until we get to sort of the end of the semester talking about the history of the APA and things like that. And hopefully you'll get an idea of the ways in which psychology was, I guess you could say, invented or constructed as a science, and how it has defined itself in relationship to other sort of parts of academic life and other parts of, intellectual inquiry in general. The way we're going to do this, since we're online, we have certain difficulties. Normally what I would do if we were doing this class traditionally face-to-face is I would take the reins for the first couple weeks and sort of get things started. And then each week I would assign a different student to basically lead the seminar that week. That's not going to be particularly possible in this situation because we don't have a seminar. We have, an asynchronous online class. So what I'm going to do is have you all make some kind of presentation that can be posted or linked to the course Canvas page. I think it's important that as, future teachers and researchers and practitioners, you get the experience of running a seminar, giving a presentation, leading a class, however you want to phrase it. And I think the best way that we can do it in our current situation is to have you sort of produce these presentations that we will then upload to the course webpage. These presentations should be about 10 to 15 minutes long. I found in my experience that if it's anything longer than 10 or 15 minutes, people won't watch it. Although I know y'all will because you're ambitious and hardworking students, but I think 10 or 15 minutes is about right for a YouTube type video. Or you can do a PowerPoint presentation, but there needs to be audio. There has to be an audio-video component to whatever it is that you do. You can't just, do a little PowerPoint thing. And I'll talk more about this, later in the semester, how we're going to, assign who does what and things like that. But that's basically what we're going to do. And those will be peer graded. That way I can make sure that everybody watches them. And the final part of the class will be, you'll also write a paper that's like 10 to 13 pages long. And the one rule is going to be is that whatever you end up presenting on, you can't write your paper about. So you can't double dip. But all of those kinds of things are better put in writing than on a video. So look at the information on Canvas and, that'll be what it is. We're going to read a lot of different things in the class, but you don't have to buy any of it. I've spent a lot of time finding PDFs and links to authors and texts that I think that we'll use in the class. And I've put them all on the Canvas webpage. And I believe it's all legal, and I believe that none of it will, infect your computer with terrible viruses. But, if you're not sure about a website, use a school computer, not your own.